Times Square, New York City. An October evening that would change two lives forever. Michael Hayes, 32 years old, clutched his 8-month-old daughter Sophie as he approached the outdoor table at Le Bernardin, the Michelin-starred restaurant. He wasn't there to dine. He hadn't eaten in 2 days, and Sophie had finished her last bottle of formula that morning. With his cheeks burning with shame, he knelt beside the table of an elegant woman dining alone. "Excuse me, ma'am," he whispered with a broken voice. Would you have any leftovers? For the baby?" The woman, Victoria Blackwood, heiress to a $3 billion pharmaceutical empire, set down her fork. When her eyes met the baby's, time stopped. Sophie had the same green eyes, the same dimple on her chin, the same birthmark behind her left ear as her daughter Emily, who had died 8 months ago. But it wasn't possible. Emily had been cremated, or at least, that's what they'd told her. Victoria stood up trembling, gently touched the baby's face, and whispered, "Emily?" The entire plaza seemed to hold its breath when Michael pulled from his pocket a gold bracelet engraved with, "For Emily, with infinite love, Mom." It was the only valuable item he hadn't sold, found in the crib when he'd adopted Sophie from the hospital 8 months earlier. The evening of October 15th wrapped Manhattan in a blanket of golden lights as the outdoor tables at Le Bernardin sparkled like diamonds against the concrete jungle. Michael Hayes had been walking for 3 hours with Sophie strapped to his chest in a worn baby carrier, the last baby item he hadn't been forced to sell. His steps were slow, calculated to conserve energy, while he watched tourists and wealthy New Yorkers dine with that carefree attitude he'd forgotten existed. A former software engineer laid off 8 months earlier when his company outsourced to India, Michael had burned through all his savings to care for Sophie after his wife Jennifer died in childbirth. The baby wasn't biologically his. Jennifer had gotten pregnant during a brief separation. But the moment he'd held that tiny life in his arms, Michael had sworn to protect her. The biological father had vanished, and Michael had signed the adoption papers without hesitation. Now, with an eviction notice for tomorrow and his last dollar spent on formula 3 days ago, Michael had reached rock bottom. His pride lay in pieces as he approached the restaurant's outdoor seating, searching for someone who might show compassion. He'd already tried 3 other restaurants that evening, chased away like any common beggar. Victoria Blackwood sat alone at the corner table, her elegant figure wrapped in a pearl-gray silk dress that cost more than the annual rent on the apartment Michael was about to lose. At 40, she embodied the understated power of old East Coast money merged with new pharmaceutical wealth. But her eyes told a different story. Empty, lifeless. Those of a mother who had buried her daughter 8 months ago. Emily had died under circumstances that still haunted Victoria. A fire in the private wing of the Swiss clinic, where the baby was being treated for a rare genetic condition. The body had been identified only through the clinic's documentation. The fire had been so devastating that nothing remained to recognize. Victoria had accepted the urn of ashes in a state of shock from which she'd never recovered. When Michael knelt beside her table, Victoria initially didn't even look up, accustomed to ignoring the panhandlers who occasionally approached in tourist areas. But when she heard Sophie's soft crying and saw the father trying to calm her with gentle rocking, something in her stirred. Michael's request was whispered with such shame and desperation that it penetrated the armor of indifference Victoria had built around herself. When she looked up to politely refuse, her eyes fell on Sophie. The world around her ceased to exist. Those green eyes with golden flecks, that particular shade she'd seen only in her daughter, the dimple that appeared when the baby grimaced, the birthmark behind the left ear, right in the exact spot where Emily had the same distinctive mark. Victoria's hands shook violently as she rose from her chair. The waiter approached, concerned, but she waved him away. She knelt before Michael, level with him, and extended a trembling hand toward Sophie's face. The baby, instead of crying as she did with strangers, smiled at her and grabbed her finger with that instinctive grip of infants. It was then that Michael, misinterpreting the gesture as compassion, pulled from his threadbare jacket's inner pocket the only valuable item he still owned, a solid gold bracelet with embedded diamonds. "If you could give me something in exchange for this," he murmured. "It's real gold. I found it in Sophie's crib when I adopted her from Mount Sinai Hospital 8 months ago. The biological mother died in childbirth, and there were no relatives." Victoria stopped breathing. The bracelet Michael held was identical to the one she'd had made for Emily by the family jeweler, with the inscription she herself had chosen. It was one of a kind, impossible to replicate. Her legs gave way, and she collapsed onto the pavement, while documents spilled from her purse and scattered in the wind. Among them, a photo of Emily taken days before her supposed death, identical to Sophie in every detail. Victoria's luxurious penthouse on the Upper East Side had transformed into an impromptu command center. Michael sat on the white leather couch with Sophie asleep in his arms, still stunned by how quickly his request for leftovers had turned into something unimaginable. Victoria paced before the panoramic windows showing illuminated Manhattan, her phone glued to her ear as she barked orders at her legal team. The story Michael told was as simple as it was heartbreaking. 8 months ago, while Jennifer was in labor at Mount Sinai Hospital, complications had been immediate and fatal. Doctors had managed to save the baby through emergency cesarean, but Jennifer had bled out. In the chaotic hours that followed, while Michael signed papers and arranged the funeral, a young nurse named Claire had handed him the baby wrapped in a hospital blanket, with the gold bracelet in the pocket. The nurse had said it was found in the crib and probably belonged to the biological mother, though there were no records of a patient matching the description. Michael, overwhelmed by grief and sudden responsibility, hadn't asked questions. He'd registered the baby as Sophie Hayes and begun his life as a single father. Victoria listened as pieces of the puzzle began forming in her mind. The Swiss clinic where Emily was hospitalized was owned by her brother-in-law, Alexander Blackwood, who managed the international branch of the family pharmaceutical empire. Alexander had always shown a morbid interest in the inheritance Emily would receive at 18, $500 million in trust funds plus company shares. The private detective Victoria had called, Thomas Morrison, arrived within an hour with a DNA test kit. As he gently collected a saliva sample from the still-sleeping Sophie, he confirmed Victoria's suspicions. There had been irregularities in the body identification at the Swiss clinic. The documents had been signed by a doctor who didn't exist, and the fire had broken out precisely when security cameras were coincidentally under maintenance. The next 24 hours were a whirlwind of revelations. The DNA test confirmed with 99.9% certainty that Sophie was Emily. Nurse Claire Ross was tracked down. She now lived in Miami with $200,000 cash deposited in her account the day after the fire. Under police interrogation, she completely broke down. The truth was monstrous in its simplicity. Alexander had orchestrated everything. He'd paid the clinic staff to declare Emily dead during a controlled fire that destroyed only documentation and an unidentified corpse procured from the black market. The baby had been sedated and transported to America, where Claire was to make her appear as an abandoned newborn at the hospital. The plan was to have her adopted by an unsuspecting family, make her disappear forever, while Alexander collected the inheritance as administrator of the deceased's estate. He hadn't anticipated that Jennifer Hayes would die in childbirth that same day, nor that Michael would adopt the baby immediately. Fate had shuffled the cards in ways even Alexander couldn't predict. For 8 months, he'd believed the plan had succeeded perfectly, while Emily, joined Sophie, grew up just miles away, in poverty but loved. Alexander Blackwood's arrest shook the foundations of New York high society. Images of the billionaire in handcuffs outside his Hamptons mansion dominated the news for days. But for Victoria, the legal battle had just begun. Officially recovering Emily meant navigating a bureaucratic labyrinth while protecting Michael, who had technically raised the kidnapped baby without knowing. Michael found himself in an impossible position. Legally, Sophie wasn't his daughter, but for 8 months he'd fed her bottles at 3 in the morning, rocked her through colic, sold everything he owned to buy diapers and medicine. The thought of losing her destroyed him, yet he understood Victoria's pain. Two parents who loved the same baby, united and divided by fate's cruelty. Victoria surprised him. Instead of ripping Sophie away, she proposed something unheard of. She wanted Michael to remain in the baby's life. She installed him in the guest apartment of her penthouse, officially hiring him as a personal assistant with a salary that left him speechless. But the truth ran deeper. She'd seen how Sophie lit up when Michael held her, how she calmed at the sound of his voice. 8 months of love couldn't be erased. Evenings in the penthouse became a strange family routine. Michael prepared baby food while Victoria played with Sophie on the Persian rug, worth more than he'd earned in a year. They talked about the baby, sharing anecdotes. Victoria about the first 4 months of life. Michael about the subsequent 8. Slowly.
Enjoying the story? Give it a little like and don't forget to subscribe. Now then, let's carry on.
Shared grief transformed into something different. One evening, while Sophie slept in her new $3,000 crib, though she still preferred Michael's old carrier, Victoria opened a bottle of 82 Chateau Margaux. She told her life story: the failed marriage to a Wall Street banker who'd married her for money, the infertility diagnosis, Emily's miracle through IVF, years of treatments that had produced one single precious embryo. Michael shared his story: childhood in the Bronx projects, the scholarship that allowed him to get his engineering degree from Columbia, the rise in the tech world, the marriage to Jennifer that collapsed under the pressure of different social expectations, the brief separation during which she'd gotten pregnant, his return and decision to raise the baby regardless of biological paternity. The trial against Alexander revealed increasingly dark ramifications. Emily wasn't his first victim. Other children from wealthy families had died under suspicious circumstances in hospitals across his network. An entire inheritance trafficking ring, with children disappeared and fortunes diverted. The press dubbed him the Manhattan Monster. During the hearings, Michael sat beside Victoria in the courtroom, Sophie and Emily taking turns in their arms. Photographers went crazy for this unconventional family: the poor adoptive father, the billionaire biological mother, the baby who had been both Sophie and Emily. But what they captured was something else. Increasingly long glances between Michael and Victoria, hands that brushed when passing the baby, shared smiles when Emily did something funny. The emotional turning point came on a November night. Emily had a high fever. Nothing serious, but enough to terrify both trauma-scarred parents. They spent the sleepless night alternating with cold compresses and medicine, walking the apartment with the baby in their arms. At dawn, when the fever finally broke, they found themselves embraced on the couch with Emily sleeping peacefully between them. Victoria looked up at Michael, seeing for the first time not her daughter's adoptive father, but the man who had sold everything for a baby that wasn't even his. The man who had loved Emily when she couldn't, who had protected her when the world tried to hurt her. Michael looked at Victoria and saw not the unreachable billionaire, but the mother who had mourned her daughter for 8 months, the woman who'd had the courage to share her daughter instead of claiming her. The kiss was as inevitable as sunrise, sweet and desperate together. 8 months of pain transforming into something new. Emily stirred between them and opened her eyes, looking at them with that ancient wisdom of babies, and laughed, that crystalline sound that heals any wound. The decision to marry wasn't discussed, simply understood. Not a marriage of convenience or passion, but of a family already formed by destiny. The tabloids went crazy. Male Cinderella, Poor father marries princess. But they didn't read the papers, too busy building a life together. 2 months after the private ceremony at City Hall, life in the Westchester estate Victoria had bought seemed like a fairy tale. Michael had returned to work, this time on his own startup funded by Victoria, developing apps to help struggling families manage finances. Emily, now officially Emily Victoria Blackwood Hayes, crawled through the gardens chasing butterflies. But the past wasn't done with them. Alexander, awaiting trial under house arrest due to his connections, orchestrated his revenge. He'd hired a journalist to dig into Michael's past, and what emerged threatened to destroy everything. Jennifer, Michael's deceased wife, hadn't died from natural childbirth causes. Medical records, mysteriously leaked to the press, showed traces of a lethal anticoagulant in her blood. The drug was manufactured by the Blackwood Company itself. The implications were devastating. It appeared Michael had killed his wife to take the baby and then seduce the wealthy biological mother. The headlines were merciless. The murderous fortune hunter. He killed to get rich. They photographed Michael taking Emily to daycare, painting him as a monster holding the baby hostage. Victoria received hundreds of messages daily, warning her of the danger, begging her to save Emily. Michael sank into deep depression. He locked himself in his old Bronx apartment, which he'd kept as an office, refusing to come home to protect Victoria and Emily from his toxic presence. He stopped answering his phone, eating, living. He'd written a goodbye letter, ready to remove himself permanently. Emily saved him, unconsciously, as only children can. Victoria, desperate, had brought the baby to the apartment. When Emily saw Michael, she began crying desperately, reaching her arms toward him, calling Dada for the first time. Not Daddy, as she'd been babbling for months, but Dada, clear and strong. In that moment, Victoria understood. She grabbed her phone and called her private investigation team. "Find the truth," she ordered. "All of it, whatever it costs." What they discovered in 72 hours of frantic investigation changed everything. The anticoagulant in Jennifer's blood had been administered by Claire Ross, the same nurse Alexander had corrupted. Not to kill Jennifer, but to cause complications requiring a cesarean, while Emily's real mother, a drug addict Alexander had paid to carry the pregnancy, gave birth in the next room. Jennifer had been collateral damage. The original plan was for her to survive with brain damage, unable to testify. Her death had been a dosage error. Michael was not only innocent, but his decision to immediately adopt Sophie had ruined Alexander's plan to make Emily disappear forever. The press conference in the Four Seasons ballroom was the media event of the year. Victoria, elegant in a black suit, held Michael's hand while the district attorney laid out the evidence of Michael's innocence and Alexander's guilt in crimes ranging from kidnapping to murder. Camera flashes were blinding, but they only looked at Emily, playing with a toy on the carpet at their feet. Alexander was sentenced to life without parole. His dismantled criminal network led to finding 3 other dead children living with unsuspecting families across the country. The Emily Foundation, created by Victoria and Michael, worked to reunite these families in the least traumatic way possible, recognizing that years of love couldn't simply be erased. A year later, in the same Times Square where they'd met, Michael and Victoria sat at a table at Le Bernardin, this time as paying customers. Emily, now almost 2, ate ice cream, getting it all over the little Gucci dress her maternal grandmother had given her. A new ring sparkled on Victoria's finger, and under the table her belly showed the first signs of new life. The miracle of the second pregnancy had come unexpectedly. Doctors couldn't explain it. Perhaps the stress of previous years. Perhaps the body finally relaxing in love. Michael had cried when they'd seen the ultrasound, twins moving on the screen as if dancing. Their story had become New York urban legend. Restaurant waiters discreetly pointed out their table to curious tourists, whispering excitedly about the poor father who'd asked for leftovers and found love. The mother who'd found her daughter believed dead. The destiny that had woven their lives in impossible ways. But for Michael and Victoria, sitting in that square where it all began, the story was simpler. It was the story of a man who'd loved a child not his own as if she were, of a woman who'd had the courage to share her daughter with a stranger, of a baby who'd had two names and two lives, but one destiny, to be loved beyond measure. As the sun set behind the Manhattan skyline, painting Times Square in liquid gold, a homeless man approached their table. Victoria, without hesitation, handed him a $100 bill. Michael added a business card from the foundation. They offered work and support to anyone who needed it. The man thanked them with tears in his eyes and walked away. Emily, with the wisdom of children who've lived more than their age suggests, looked at her parents and said with perfect clarity, "Daddy was sad, Mommy was sad, now happy together." Then she returned to her ice cream as if she'd solved all the universe's mysteries. A passing photographer captured that moment. Michael and Victoria looking at each other over Emily's head, eyes full of tears and laughter, hands intertwined on the table where it all began. The photo made the front page of the New York Times the next day with the headline, "Love that Rises from Ashes," but they didn't see it. They were too busy living their modern fairy tale, where princes can be poor, princesses can be broken by grief, and happy endings are built one day at a time with patience, forgiveness, and the ability to see beyond appearances. The last scene Times Square remembers of them is this: a family rising from the table, the father picking up the sleeping child, the mother caressing her belly where two new lives grow, as they disappear into the New York night. They're no longer the broke single dad and the lonely millionaire. They're simply Michael, Victoria, and Emily, a family forged by pain but defined by love. And as their figures vanish into the streets of Manhattan, the waiter who'd served them that first night whispers to the newcomer, "See, sometimes miracles really do happen. Sometimes you just need the courage to ask for leftovers to receive a feast. Sometimes destiny knows what it's doing, even when it seems cruel." The lights of Times Square continue to flash, indifferent and eternal, witness to another New York love story that defied the odds. And somewhere in the night, another desperate father clutches the Emily Foundation business card, hoping for his personal miracle. Because this is the truth that New York whispers to those who know how to listen. Every love story begins with an act of courage. Sometimes that courage is asking for help when you've hit rock bottom. Sometimes it's offering help when your heart is broken. And sometimes, just sometimes, these two courages meet and create something greater than both. Hit like if you believe true miracles are born from the most unlikely encounters. Comment with the moment that touched your heart. Share this story with someone who needs to know that even in the darkest moments, love always finds a way. Subscribe for more stories that show how destiny uses our falls to make us fly higher.